It's been a full year since I built my dream F1 circuit in City Skylines 2, but things have moved on and new cities get built. So today I'm building the Dutch F1 circuit Zandvoort in our fictional Dutch city of Noevorden. On the banks of the waterway I'll be creating an international level circuit featuring everything you would expect from a track of this stature. Proper F1 cars, grandstands, a pit lane, proper circuit runoffs, realistic barriers, branding, a fan zone, a paddock, support vehicles, maybe even an incident or two, and I'll even have a go at making those famous banked corners. This has been an absolute shed load of work and I'm going to talk you through all the techniques, tips and mods to help bring the circuit to life. But first, I'd like to get you guys familiar with the circuit itself, and what better way than to talk you through an in-car flying lap on F1 25. Now I'm going to use that term flying lap very loosely. I am not very good at this circuit, and as you can see, it took more than a few attempts to get a clean lap under my belt. But eventually, persistence pays off and I managed to get it done. At the end of the video, I am going to be doing an in-car lap on the City Skylines 2 circuit, so look out for that, you'll probably want to check it out. Okay, here we go, so a flying lap with Piccana, and off we are. We've got turn 1 under our belt, turn 2 now, on to turn 3, and this is one of the famous banked corners. I can only imagine that that would be an enormous amount of fun to drive in real life. We're going to be flat out in this S's section. We want to make sure that we are not clipping any of the sand or any of the grass on the edge and send us flying. Still flat out here in this section even though we're dropping a gear, and again we're going to pick up the pace and enter what is probably the most awkward corner of the circuit. Down to third gear, but we can take a minute and have a look around us. As you can see, we've got the sand dunes beside us, we've got some really tall cranes which I would love to have got into this particular build, but unfortunately we just don't really have the asset for it. Down into the chicane here, we've got a big jumbotron, we're absolutely putting that in. Orange Army there on our right making some noise. Again onto the penultimate corner, and again these two are going to have heavy banks. Banks on these corners can be anything up to 20 degrees. Final corner, fan zone on our left, onto the main straight, and we are just going to wrap up the lap. So this is a nice way to pick up some detailing ideas and some features, and it absolutely helped in the research of this build. So job number 1 is to get the layout of the track put in place and put it in the right place in the map. I've decided to have this little spot over beside the water. I think it's going to make sense here. Obviously, it's not by the beach. This is Zandvoort, but I am not making all these sand dunes. That is high on the list of things that I definitely don't want to be doing in City Skylines 2. I think from a performance point of view, it would just involve a million decals and this city would run like a bag of spanners. So not really an option. To get the scale of the track correct, I just needed to really just draw something out and just check out the overall length of the track itself. So first time it was about 7 kilometers, this time it was 4.6. That's not too far off. I think the real Zandvoort is 4.3 kilometers if I remember correctly. So happy with the scale, wasn't quite happy with the position, and I thought I'd move it a little bit closer to the water, make things a little bit more interesting, and I reckon this is not a bad spot, and we've got the main city over across the water, and that's going to make some pretty nice views. So obviously I've made a few tracks before. The very first track I just made it a 3-lane road, and then I just hid the markings. The downside of that, of course, though, is that you cannot get a racing line. The cars will just basically use whatever lane they want. When I made the Magarigawa track, what I decided to do on that one was to actually use a single lane, use that as the racing line, and then just essentially build a track around it. But that's not going to work here because of the curved sections. Not the curved sections, the banked sections, but we're going to cover that in a bit more detail later on in the video. One thing I did want to do early on was just to get the elevation down on the track. Now the track itself, when you have a look around the fast lap that you saw earlier on, you probably will have noticed that there's quite a lot of ups and downs on that track. Now, believe it or not, the actual elevation change is only 9 meters. Although it might appear on first glance that it is a super hilly track on these sand dunes, it is in fact not that much. It's just a twisty track, and the elevations themselves are on the short sections. So it looks like it has more of an elevation change than it actually does. And I think that the banked corners kind of emphasize that change of elevation even that little bit more. Now I'm going to show you how I made the banked corners. Now this is just a practice one, but it's going to show you all the different bits and pieces that I've done rather than showing you in the track itself. So I just drew out parallel lines with a path, just a normal pedestrian path, raised one of them with the move it tool, and then we're just going to terraform on the outside and bring the ground up to that lower height. Once we've done that, we just smooth it out, and that's it. Bank sections. It's as simple as that. So we can just take a minute and quickly chuck a surface on here. You'll have a better idea or a clearer idea of just exactly the undulations in the land and exactly how they pan out. So as you can see, it's looking relatively smooth. Anything that you do to the ground after this will be taking away that smoothness, so keep that in mind. You absolutely do need those two networks, you need those two paths. If you remove one of them, that slope will basically just disappear. So next up, we're just going to be adding an invisible road. Pretty straightforward, just curve it around like you would do any other road. And now what I'm going to do is just quickly demonstrate and really just check and make sure that everything is going to work. Now, one real jank section that you're going to get is the invisible road connecting to the normal road, and really haven't found any good method of trying to negate that. If you are going to try it yourself, I would suggest don't go with the first try, give it a couple of different options, a few different angles, and just see if you can try and get the jank out of it somewhat. It won't be perfect, but you can improve it if it's truly terrible. Again, another bit of jank here you can see is the elevation changes on the roads themselves. Kind of goes into the actual bank itself, sometimes it's above the bank. Again, I spent a huge amount of time trying to just see if I could improve on that using Move It and various other bits and pieces, and really there's no great solution. You're just going to get a bit of weirdness on there. If you are thinking, why don't I just run perhaps maybe just a single lane highway, that doesn't work. As soon as you lay down any normal road as opposed to an invisible road, that land is going to flatten out the terrain, so your nice looking slope that you have going right the way around that corner will just completely disappear, and you're going to have a huge flat section. It looks terrible, it just doesn't work. So you've got to use invisible ones, and you've got to just work through the jank. The plan for the main track itself is to give it an outline. We'll give it some thick white lines. That will be the your perimeter line of the actual circuit itself. And then what we're going to do is just basically stick a surface on it. Super simple, doesn't take too long, nice and straightforward, just tracing a line, and we are going to get a nice tidy looking circuit. So don't have to mess about with too many decals, and we don't have to mess about with too many surfaces either, so happy days. So here we're on turn 3, this is where we have that really sharp bank on the road. I think it's about 20 degrees in fact, which is wild for an F1 track. Kind of reminds me of the carousel on the Nürburgring. I'm going to make this as close to the real thing as I possibly can with the tools at my disposal. So again, we're going to use those paths. They are absolutely essential for dictating the different heights, and then we're going to use a little bit of terraforming and just try and smooth things out. Now, of course, everything looks like it's coming together really quickly. This took me hours, just this section, to be honest, guys. It's super fiddly. It's not that easy to do, but once it's done, hopefully it will be worth it. So we need to do just a little bit of smoothing out here once we've got it in. Once we've got everything smoothed out, it's then time to get the actual racing line in, and I'm going to do this just to the best of my ability. As you saw earlier on, that racing ability is limited, so I'm going to do my best here, don't judge. Let's have a little look and just see how that is panned out. I think we're okay with that so far. Layout's looking good. I think shortly we're going to be ready to ditch the overlay. We'll really not need that too much. I am going to refer to it every now and again just to get a little bit of a guidance in terms of some of the areas outside of the track, but I think for the most part we can pretty much switch that off now. This next section is going to be really important if you're trying to make this yourself. You're going to see that there is additional normal road sections on here, and that sort of connection there where we have a really shallow angle coming on and off it, that's pretty much what I'd recommend for the minimum jank on the actual circuit itself. So the reason why we need these extra normal roads, if you like, is that we're going to be creating a bus line. That bus line you cannot make on invisible roads. It just simply won't work. You can't place a stop on it. It's not going to happen. So what you need to do is to create a couple of different sections where you're going to have waypoints on your bus route, and then you're going to connect them together using the invisible roads. Now, as you'll have seen there, sometimes they just simply won't work. They won't hook up, you get a pathfinding error, and that just basically means that the invisible road isn't connected to the normal road. There's no easy way of telling whether or not it's connected. It's just going to be a little bit of trial and error, but here you can see that it is connecting on both sections, and that means that you should be able to complete a whole lap or a whole route. Perfect. Now here, as you're going to be able to see, we're not going to be able to actually do a full circuit lap because we don't have another section. So I've put another one down here just beside where the pit lane's going to be. Let's give it the first waypoint. We'll give it the second waypoint. That is working now. And what we're going to do is we're just going to repeat that process a few times. And that means that when we've got our buses or we've got our cars on here, then they are going to do a few laps. We're just going to complete it by clicking on that bus stop, and all going well, we should get vehicles on this just soon. Now I do plan on getting cars on here eventually, but for now, just to make sure things are working, we're going to run the buses. So it looks like we're going to get a full lap out of this. You can see that they've used the actual pit lane exit, which is really nice to see. They're going to be doing a little mini loop here near the pit lane. That is essentially going to give them an exit route when they are looking to go back to the depot. But yeah, obviously we've got quite a few vehicles running on here, but the main point is that it does work. Now here's an in view of that turn, and yeah, it kind of looks bad to be honest, but I promise you I spent absolutely ages on it and I couldn't get a better result than that. Now you see me do a quick save there. The reason is that I did the whole track and then I accidentally deleted the surface, had to do the whole thing again. But yeah, at least that's looking a bit more like a track now. Happy days. The final thing that I need to address are just the lines that are left by the real roads that we have. The surface doesn't cover this one up, which is fine, but we're going to use Algendo's decals, and I think, you know, we can get away with that looking like part of the racing line, to be honest, and from a distance, you don't really see it too bad. In this chapter, I'm going to put together the grandstands and do a little bit of surface work and really just try and figure out the layout for the big stuff. I'm going to be fairly brutal when it comes to cutting things out on this section. I've got a ton of footage, got about 30 hours to work my way through, and even after a rough cut, that usually brings my video time down to roughly what it tends to be when it goes to YouTube. This is still sitting at almost 2 hours, so I'm going to get chopping and hopefully we can get through this pretty quick. So for the main grandstand, I'm going to be using a number of assets. I'm going to use some of the transport ones, some of the school add-ons or extensions, and we're going to couple that together with some of the offices at the back and then some garages, which obviously makes sense because this is going to be behind the pit lane. Rounding this off, I'm going to use some of Fragrant Ott's glass custom assets. Looks really good and it solves a nice problem there for me as well. Now this was looking a little janky and it's going to look a little bit weird when it came to the actual pit lane itself. So along the front, that sort of Art Deco transport building, I'm going to put that on a little bit of a slope and it should match up a little bit better to the ground that we're building on. We're still really limited in terms of stadium assets, so I'm going to use just the only sports stands basically that we have. I am going to mirror the ones that are in the real life track. I think it makes sense to do that, and I don't have to think about it too much either. Pretty straightforward. We just pop them out and then we're going to be able to detail these things a little bit later on. I think it was about in this time in the build when I started sort of freaking out and just when the realization dawns just exactly how much work this is going to be. There's going to be some really huge gaps and big spaces to fill, and as you know yourself, if you're going to try and detail them up, it does take a bit of time. Now along the back of some of the corners, what I wanted to do was to recreate some of the topography that we see in Zandvoort. Now, I made it clear that I have no intention in making sand dunes, but I would like at least more than a bit of a nod to the topography of the circuit itself. So what I'll be doing here periodically is adding a little bit of height and then really recreating some of the curvatures and the slopes and some of the background really that you see when people are racing on this track. It's definitely not a one-to-one recreation in terms of the topography, but at least we've got some of the more recognisable elements of the circuit in play here, and I think that's going to make a real big difference. Now every now and again when I was checking out the videos and the pictures and all that sort of stuff that I was doing to research the track, there were a few elements that sort of jumped out at me that I thought, do you know what, I need to get it in now because I'll end up forgetting about it. And that 5G mast, or the couple of 5G masts that we're doing, along with the big radio one behind the main grandstand, were just a couple of elements that were screaming to be put in right there and then. Round the back of some of the stands, I will be putting in some of the hospitality stuff. Again, some of these things take up quite a bit of space and they're actually going to form quite a big chunk of the non-circuit space that we're going to be using up here. And again, because it's one of the bigger elements, I want to get it in early rather than sort of detailing stuff and then having to, you know, mess about with it and remove it or move it or do whatever we need to do. So we'll get that stuff in early doors and then we don't have to worry about it too much as we build on. Now you're going to see me work on this little bit of track. I completely forgot to put that in when I was doing the main build. That's not quite the finished article just yet. I will be coming back and adjusting that. And that same goes with these stands as well. These are actually a higher elevation in the real track, so I wanted to kind of show that off a little bit. And again, we'll take the opportunity to get it done early doors. Around the outside of these corners we are going to have quite a number of runoffs that will involve sand. Now what I wanted to do was to really just have, on at least some of them, is to have a little bit of a grass border or a grass edge, and the easiest way, the cleanest way of getting some nice curves on that is to draw out a net lane, then draw out the surfaces, and then delete the net lane. I'll get my words out. So on some of them they're going to have the grass verge, some of them I'm not going to bother, but again I just want to mirror what I see on the real track. So I just wanted to point this out. If you are recoloring lots of little things, you don't have to do them individually. You can use the selection tool. You just want to make sure that you have the category changed to props. You know, if you're doing props, for example, like I am here, and then you can do it just in one fell swoop. There you go, one click and they're all done. So don't do what I'm doing, use that. So as I said earlier on, I am going to be adding a little bit of height to some of these corners, and again we're going to be using the paths, going to be raising the paths, and then we're just going to be terraforming around them. So we're going to use that for some of the corners for just the sand, so where we have the sand going basically up in elevation, I want to recreate that. Behind some of these sand runoff areas we also have some viewing areas for fans, so again I'm going to recreate that and just add an extra network, get it raised up, and we're just going to terraform around it, and much the same as you've seen earlier on when we're doing the bank sections on the track itself. Now some of these sections didn't really play nice, they couldn't just use the smooth tool unfortunately, so had to go in there and do what I was really trying to avoid elsewhere on the track, and that's just to kind of go around and individually do slopes along the actual track themselves. You don't tend to get the best result doing that, however if you're really careful with the strengths on the tools then you can work your way around it. For anybody who's seen Noevorden episodes in the past, you know that we do have a few issues with flooding. I thought it was sorted last episode. Unfortunately, our flooding is back. So I am going to just spend a bit of time. I found the culprit. It's basically just the bridge is too low. So raised it up, added a little bit of height on the dikes here, and hopefully once I speed up this water, all is good to go. One thing you might notice here is that the actual fields are looking a hell of a mess on the left hand side there. That is because the mod that I used to hide all of that stuff is actually broken. So the Extractors Be Gone mod basically hides all of that stuff. Unfortunately it broke in the last patch, so that farmland is going to look really messy unfortunately until perhaps, hopefully fingers crossed, that mod gets an update. So next up, what we have is the perimeter road. Perimeter road is basically going to give access to all of our service vehicles. We're going to be adding a ton of service vehicles as the build continues. Very straightforward, we're just going to use a basic 2-lane alley road. Again, but we can use it to help detail and help really just shape the contours and shape the overall topography of the track and its surrounding area. Now this is still looking pretty rough and pretty janky, but this is all the stuff that needs to be done before we can start making it look really good. Now it's time to add some water features. The water features, really I'm just going to mirror the ones on the real life track again. I don't need to think about it too much. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to extend out some of the extra topography stuff that we spoke about earlier on. Now although I'm not quite finished this section, I think it's time to just check in and see how things are looking. I'm actually really happy with that so far. Let's take away the actual overlay and see how it looks. Looks pretty basic so far, doesn't it? But we've not done really any detailing whatsoever, and we've still got a bit more to work on in terms of putting in that perimeter road and the topography and some of the waterworks. So let's crack on with that and we'll get the rest of the surfaces put in. Now it's time to turn our attention back to the track itself. I needed a little bit of work done on these grandstands. They were looking super untidy around the back, so I just decided to slot in a few ploppables. I'm going to put some of the office assets around the back, and that should look the part. Remember, the invisible road networks are absolutely locked in. As soon as they're done, really, I can't touch them. They'll break and I'll have to redo them, so we're going to avoid that for sure. So if there is a little bit of jankiness and a little bit of unevenness in the circuit, and especially you'll see that perhaps around the pit lane, there's nothing I'm going to do about that, to be honest. So what I will be doing, however, though, is just tidying up the surface work and the net lanes and making this thing look like a proper pit lane. Now the good news is the surfaces are there already, so really it's just a case of just shifting them about and making sure that they look the right scale in the right position. Now one thing I did notice was that the pit lane here where the wall is does not actually terminate directly onto the track itself. So there's a bit of a gap that goes around the inside of the track, and I wanted to recreate that here. What I will be able to do is add a bit of colour on this later on with some surfaces, but for now we're going to be adding the net lanes from the Piccana F1 or the Dream F1 circuit pack by Elgendo. It's got my name on it, I should really be getting that title correct. But I'm going to basically just apply this everywhere where you would expect it in the normal track, directly all the way around it. Now, I won't show you what all, but you know, the gist is you lay it down, and if you have to adjust it, you can adjust it with the manipulation mode on Move It. Where it makes sense, and there will be a few areas where I've not quite got all the surface work done, the big areas where we have the sand runoffs, make sure we get them in place just now, and really we're getting to the point where we want to try and make sure that things are starting to get tidied up a little bit. One thing I would have really liked to have done in this track would be to add a splash of colour on the walls around the circuit. Now unfortunately it's really not possible, there's only a couple of colours you can choose from on the net lanes, and there's no way of applying decals. Specifically, I'd be looking to add branding decals onto that net lane. So the walls themselves are going to have to be plain white, but I will be taking the opportunity to add branding obviously to the track, but maybe not as much as I would have preferred to in this particular circuit. The only real workaround for that would have been to put down, billboards or signs and then apply decals onto that. But doing the entire circuit individually one by one, that doesn't sound like a task that I would enjoy, and I don't think anybody else would realistically. So we use what we have, and you can judge it for yourself. But what we can do now is take a little quick run through the circuit. You're going to see things here that are looking a little bit uneven and a little bit janky, and that's fine. They will all be smoothed out, so don't worry too much about that. We'll have a proper look at the whole circuit once we're finished, of course, as well. But at least taking a step back, we can have a look and see if there's anything that really does need adjustment. I'd think that little grass verge around the sand, for example, I think I'd like to make that a little bit smaller. Obviously we can see that some of the elevation changes, especially around the sand dunes there, not the sand dunes, the sand runoffs are looking a little bit uneven, but that'll just take a little bit of work with the smoothing tool, so not too worried about that. Really I'm just checking for layout and seeing if there's any real obvious big mistakes that need to be adjusted and addressed now before we start moving on and applying all the little bits and pieces in terms of details. So now we can add a little bit of detail onto the track itself. I'm not going to be touching the main track now, so that is basically locked in. I noticed these little lines going across the track. I don't know if they just indicate different sectors on the track. I didn't look into it too much. And again, what we're going to be doing is making sure that we have some proper safety barriers here as well. Now the good news with this is that I don't need to go around and recolor these things individually, which is a great time saver. But again, same technique, we're just going to use the line tool and we're going to trace the fence above the wall that we've put in already. So we just elevate it when we're putting it in. Elevation is 0.6 and that will give us a nice combined barrier stroke safety barrier combo. Now that was looking awfully white, so I just wanted to bring that down a little bit, make it a little bit of a grey one, and that should give us a more metallic look on this, which is what I'm going for. So we identified a few things that we wanted to change when we were scanning through the track, so I'm going to come back and just revisit those grass verges that we have there. As I say, they were just a little bit too big in places, a little bit too small in places in fact as well, and then we're just going to smooth out the lumps and bumps that we have around the track. And again, once we do this, of course, what I need to do is just reapply some of the individual heights on the safety barriers. They will get shifted out of place once we terraform. Well, they're not shifting out of place, I guess. Everything else is shifting out of place, against its fixed position, but that's fine. It's easy done. We just select them and we can change elevations up and down. Again, pointed out that some of those sand areas were looking a little bit uneven, so we'll get all of that stuff fixed. I'm not showing you all because it took forever, but it is what it is. So it's time for a few minutes to take a little bit of a break from the track. One thing I noticed is that I didn't have any dikes on this part of the map, so I needed to do a little bit of terraforming here and really just bring the levels down a little bit. Now, I will be careful not to bring it down too much, and I will be careful not to break the dikes and flood the place like you saw in the farming area earlier on. But yeah, I think it makes a bit of a difference. It brings it much closer down to sea level. And what I'd like to do is, again, is just raise the highways around the back of it as well. As you usually see these in the Dutch countryside, they will be raised a little bit higher than the rest of the ground surrounding it. Now, in terms of infrastructure, I'm just going to pull in some of the networks that we have in place already from previous episodes. So we'll bring the highway into something that's a little bit more appropriate rather than that just that ugly little road. And I will also, for future episodes, be thinking a little bit ahead, and we're going to be bringing over the tram networks over here. We've got that little sort of multi-transport interchange type thing on the go here, which will look really cool once we've got everything connected to it. And we're going to connect the actual bike lanes as well. So for the bike lanes, we're going to have a bit of a triple underpass under here. So we're just going to simply just mark out where I want the elevated places to be, or elevated parts to be, slope it out, smooth it out, pull it across, and then we should be good to go with those networks. Pretty straightforward. Here I'm thinking we're probably going to bring the rail right over the road and onto wherever, you know, that neighbourhood is going to be in the future, and then the bike lane will connect that to the wider network. Hopping back over the water, we're going to revisit our mixed-use development here where we have our suburbs. And again, it's just a case of connecting and expanding the networks that are there already. And talking about expansion, I just want to expand our low density commercial or low density residential. I'm going to use copy paste for this. We've got a couple of blocks already, so just going to select them and literally copy and paste them over here. And what I'm then going to do is take smaller blocks, copy and paste, and I'm just going to place them individually, and we'll create a bit of an extension on this neighbourhood, and that will sort of round out that entire area, which is pretty nice. I will of course make sure it's connected, so we'll make the little roundabouts, connect the new roads, delete the roundabout, and that's going to give us our single junction to work with. Lovely. Now, although we don't have any public services over on this new little part of the neighbourhood, they are all connected with pedestrian and bike connectivity, so they will be able to really use all of the features of the neighbourhood regardless of where they are, and without crossing too many busy roads or even having to actually go on the busy roads themselves. Now, the focus of this video of course is the F1 track, so I don't really want to spend too much time just expanding out residential areas, but at least I wanted to give you guys a feel for what was covered in its entirety in this particular episode. So I'm not going to spend really any time detailing, I'll skip on just shortly. But one thing I did want to do is just revisit some of the surfaces. They didn't come over when we copied and pasted, so they had to be revisited and put back in. But other than that, the infrastructure is pretty straightforward. We'll create a nice little roundabout here. Make sure that we have a little bit extra capacity, because I will be adding a bit more residential in here before the episode finishes, and I want to make sure that the place isn't going to grind to a halt. So let's switch our focus back to the track and address a few bits and pieces that I want to sort out. So most of the surfaces are pretty much done and dusted by now, so that's ideal. What I can do is really just pick the final surfaces that I want to use. I'm going to use the sidewalk ones around most of the stands and the grandstands. I think that does look a little bit nicer. Around some of the maintenance areas and whatnot, we're going to be using something a bit different, whether that's something a bit lighter or perhaps something a bit darker. And we can make its own little mini feature out of those. Around the track itself, I will be using a ton of Gagas grass surfaces, really just to give us a slightly different tone from one area to the next. We use that a lot in the city, I'm going to continue to do so. And here we've just added some of these stewards, kiosks, or whatever you would call it. I'm not quite sure the correct terminology, but we'll make sure they're in. We'll get them recolored and we'll get them dotted around the track. There are a few bits and pieces around the track where we're missing a bit of connectivity, so I'm going to create some paths, nice and easy. I can just use net lanes for them, which is ideal. And there are a few areas that are missing fences and really securing areas where the public shouldn't be getting into, so I'll make sure that that is all nice and safe. One major thing that's going to be missing from this track is the orange army. I'm not putting them in. I think this track for me is perhaps in the middle of a practice session. It's going to be maybe a Wednesday or a Thursday practice session. Not putting the crowds in. It's just far too much work. I've done it before, and you know, they have to be placed individually on the stands, and it's just not feasible. I'm not spending weeks doing that. It's ridiculous, obviously. But as a bit of a tribute to the orange army that are missing, I'm going to make all the grandstands orange, and at least we've got the colour theme correct. In terms of the vegetation choices for the track, as I said earlier on, we're not making sand dunes here. It just would take far too many decals, which I don't want to use. So rather than that, I'm just going to use a bit of a selection of trees here. And although we've got some undulating topography, you know, as I say, we're not trying to make the dunes, so it's going to make sense putting some bigger trees, I guess, on here instead. And it's just one of these things that I need to balance up between trying to create what's there already in real life, balancing that off against, you know, what we can do in game and advantages and disadvantages that go along with that. I am going to take a bit more Zandvoort in terms of inspiration here. We're going to have a mobile home park, caravan park, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to shift it away from its original position, so we have that. In the real life one, it's against the sea, well, between the sea and the circuit, and of course we've changed the orientation on this, but we do have a bit of water, so I'm going to shift it around the back of the circuit, and we're going to make a little bit of a feature over there as well. Quite straightforward, really quick putting this together. I'm not doing anything fancy, I'm just creating a little bit of a road network. I'm going to be spacing them out so people do have a little bit of room to breathe, chucking a bit of water. Tree brush basically is all I'm going to do on that one. I'm not doing any surface work on it at all, but it will add to the overall area and it will act as a nice background without actually spending an awful lot of time on it. The other thing I wanted to do again is just make sure that it's fenced off. It's not part of the circuit, so we want to make sure that the general public are kept well out of it and nice and safe. Within the confines of the circuit itself, I'm not going to be using any big trees, so we're going to be using some of the grass assets that we have on Paddock's mods, and we'll be adding some of the much smaller trees as well. I don't really want to block views, and I think it'd be a wee bit inappropriate having, you know, really large trees within the circuit itself, other than perhaps where we have some larger areas where it kind of maybe makes sense to do so. Now where we have the steward station, I am going to add some decals on there. Again, I'm going pretty light on it, but I just wanted to have a little feature of these things. We are going to be adding some service vehicles along with it as well. What I will do, it looks a little bit odd obviously in isolation, but we're going to be using surfaces there to create you know, little access roads on and off the track, and it will make a little bit more sense once you see it a bit later on in the video. So now that we're at the stage where we're adding individual props, it kind of signifies the point in the video where we're going to really start drilling down into the details and the nitty gritty. We're more than halfway through the video now, and I reckon we can change our focus to some of the smaller details that you're going to find in the track. So obviously around the back of the pit lane, I wanted to add a bit of colour and make sure that all of the logistic trucks are in there and present. Along the main grandstand, I was missing a roof, so I wanted something a little bit unique. Now this is essentially a pillar asset. I'm not sure which mod it's from. It might potentially be from one of the new bridge mods, but I'm not actually 100% sure, I'll be honest with you. I'm going to use the floating dock pack by Noevorden. These little individual assets are super useful, and if you like building really intricate infrastructure, then this is the pack for you. You basically have a couple of little pieces and then you can spend the next half hour putting them all into place. But what you will find though is that you can actually have real control over it, and you can build these little structures. And what I'm going to be doing is building a cantilever roof. I want to say it's called a cantilever roof, I think it is. We'll just shift them into place, stick it on the roof, chop off the excess that we don't need, and we should get a pretty nice result once we've just filled the gap. Little things like that do actually make quite a significant difference to the overall look, don't they? Now back to the pit lane, I'm going to give it its correct line, or line rather, sorry. I had a dotted line there where it should have been a solid. Along the actual pit lane itself, we're going to use again one of Algendo's net lanes from the F1 pack, and then tidy things up a little bit just by putting in the net lanes and giving them some nice curves and generally just spending a little bit of time on it. Now, to say sorry to the Orange Army, again, I'm just going to chuck in as much orange into this track as I possibly can. So the main grandstands are going to be sponsored by Iron Brew for no other reason than the colour fits and matches with the stands. And it's part of the pack, so I'm definitely going to use it. All of the grandstands are going to get plenty of sponsors as well. So again, just using what we've got in the pack. There will be a few opportunities where I want to grab a few other packs where we have branding, and we'll basically make our own and really just make up whatever marketing stuff that we want. I'd really love to see some Heineken decals or maybe Qatar Airlines and that kind of stuff, but we've got some pretty good alternatives, and I'll just be chucking in basically everything that I think is going to be appropriate, really right the way around the track. I think one of the things about making these tracks is that they can be maybe a little bit dull, so I'm really going to just chuck in as much colour as I can, to be perfectly honest. Might be a little bit too much, might be not enough, but I'll let you decide come the finishing cinematics. Now, our starting grid was far too compact, so I'm just going to use Move It and just space these things out a little bit, just deselecting one at a time and just shifting it back. But I reckon that's a bit more like it really, isn't it? It was looking a little bit strange. I'm going to have some overhead branding as well, so we're going to be using copy and paste, which is great to have. Control-C is back in the game now, happy days, and I'm just going to shift them into place with Move It. Now, Move It itself is going to have a copy and paste facility. It is an alpha, it's been tested, but I needed to really just move an awful lot of net lanes around, and it's not supported in that particular version. So having Control-C and Move It together is a real treat. Now, there were issues with these blooming decals. The branding elements do look significantly better, for me anyway, when the entire board is completely green or completely blue. However, I was having some problems getting the last decal placed at the front, so ended up having to put down, 10 decals or whatever just to kind of cover the thing, and frankly, I don't want to be chucking down a million decals if it can be helped. So what I decided to do was just space them out, just have an individual one, and it works fine, especially from a bit of a distance. Now, turn 3 does have proper branding on the track itself, or on the outskirts of the track, and I definitely wanted to make sure that we have that in place. It's super important for me to have that in. I think that looks really nice, to be honest, and just at the end of each of these net lanes, we're going to be tapering them off with a little bit of surface work as well. And again, these are the little details that actually make the big difference come the end result. Now, in this section, I want to kind of cover some of the bits that perhaps I might have skipped out previously. First thing I'm going to do is just basically add a bit of detail to all of these corners and these impact zones. I'm going to place barrels which will act as tyres. The nice thing is that in the real track they are all black, so I don't have to recolour any of that stuff, which is ideal. One thing you will notice in these overpasses, or not overpasses, what would you call them? Overhead, branding things, they will stick out in the track a little bit or be on the side of the track, which is obviously really dangerous. You wouldn't see that on a normal track, but they are just a little bit too narrow to fit tracks in most of the places. What I decided to do was to just pick one of them and just try and see what was required in terms of adjustments to get it looking good and just narrow the track in at least one particular part. Now, usually I'd have kept this stuff out because it's just finicky and it's just adjustments, but I kind of wanted to show you guys why I'm not doing the rest of them. It takes forever. It's obviously speeded up here, but everything needs to be readjusted. The net lanes need to be redone. All of the individual fencing parts need to be redone. The terraforming in some parts need to be redone as well, and frankly it's just too much work. It's I think we've got 5 or 6 of these, maybe 3 or 4 of these, I'm not entirely sure, but I'm only going to spend the time on one, and obviously it's quite a bit of finicky work, and we just do a quick save at the end of that and make sure that all of the things are locked down and that they won't move. Now, one nice feature of this track is that with the branding that we've got, we're able to really just give each individual corner its own real character. So here where we have turn 3, we are going to have Armco here on the actual branding itself. Where we have the hairpin, we can make a little bit of a start on injecting a bit of colour here as well. So we'll be using some of the Pirelli, P0 stuff and Red Bull, and we're going to be adding a bit more to this later on as well. So it should look pretty good by the time we got it finished, and we just, as I say, inject that bit of colour. So I reckon having the branding around the corners as well as the overhead elements, I think it kind of gives each bit of the track its own character, which I really do enjoy. So here we're going to make a little bit of a start on some of the service vehicles that you see dotted around the map. Now, what I'm going to be doing here is just use one of the extractor vehicles here, and they will basically extract the cars if they, if they crash. I also want to have facilities to remove the cars, so I'm going to have some trailers and some trucks here, and we can get them lifted, get the cars lifted onto the trucks, and away they go onto safety. Now, I did make a little bit of a start on the decaling work here, so I'm just going to extend that out a little bit just to kind of cover the additional vehicles that we have. And I think I mentioned earlier on, I'm going to extend them by putting some surface work around it as well. So should make a little bit more sense once that surface is in and we have some proper exit routes and access routes around the stadium, or around the track rather. It was time now to extend the branding that we have on the main grandstand. I'm going to put that right the way around the track really. Again, nice and easy, pretty straightforward. Does take a little bit of time, but again, it just adds that little bit of contrast on the stands and that extra little bit of colour. And very importantly, we make sure that it's all sponsored by Iron Brew. Now, there were a few gaps here, but I didn't have the fencing done, so we'll address that, make sure that they're in. Again, make sure that they're the right colour. I quite like that little area there, pretty cool. I think we've got a nice little spot there to add the detail as well. Now, this is the surface work I spoke about earlier on. What I am going to do is I'm going to border it off and make sure that we have got a proper curb. It didn't quite look right without it, so again, having these sort of almost parallel lines that are running nice and smooth, nice and curved, it does make all the difference, and I thoroughly recommend that you spend that time doing it too, if you're going to make the track yourself, of course. Now, to add a little modern splash to the track itself, I am going to, on the inside of the curves, mostly on the inside of the curves, I am going to have these little runoff sections. I definitely don't want the whole track to be done, whoops, but this will provide a nice bright contrast to some of the rest of the stuff that's around it. I'm going to do it just uniform. I'm just going to go for the orange. Again, a little nod to the Orange Army, but also kind of fits the branding of the channel as well. So I'm certainly going to lean into it, and I'm going to make it nice and consistent right the way around it. So it'll be a key differentiation from what you see on the real life one. Of course, on the real life one, you've got various different marketing, branding that is part of that track. Like I'm thinking Heineken, Rolex, potentially Qatar Airways, I'm not too sure. But of course, the only way of me really adding that on was maybe potentially making something on right everywhere, but that is just something that I'm just not going to get into. So I'm going to keep it nice and simple, keep the branding on track, and we're going to make it our own little version of the track essentially, which is really what we've done the whole video. This isn't really a one-to-one, although we've got the same layout and we've got a ton of stuff that you see on the real life one. It's very much about making it our own. In this section, I'm going to tackle the paddock, the fan areas, some of the track lighting, how to do the cars, and work on the pit lane, and maybe add a couple of incidents into the track as well. The paddock in F1 is a temporary structure, or multiple temporary structures. Really what the team does is use these as, garages, engineering areas, hospitality suites, tyre storage, media zones, all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to build out just a kind of modest one really. Nothing too fancy. I'm going to use a combination of trucks, and a lot of the Japanese office assets come into play here as well. The shapes that we can put together with the buildings, I think it fits relatively well, and of course space is always at a premium in these tracks, and we're going to just cram things in really tight together. So plenty of trucks, plenty of vans, really not that much detailing, but I want to get it nice and colourful, and that should reflect what the paddock looks like when all the teams are there with their team colours. In the middle, I think I can kind of create a little bit of a more private area. I guess that's potentially one of the many VIP areas that you would expect on a track. But certainly in terms of the actual sort of street level details, I'm going to go really, really light on it. Just going to add something that's going to look a little bit decent from a distance without spending too much time on the close-ups. One thing I'm conscious of in this build is really just the overall time spent on the entire project. I think I said at the beginning, it took about 30 hours, recording. Obviously that's before we start on any of the editing or anything else, or taking into consideration research for the actual track before we start. However, that said, although I want to go kind of lighter on the detailing in these sections of the track, there you know, potentially a bit less important than the actual circuit itself, it's still for me important to have at least a minimum amount of detailing on here and making sure that we don't have any really awkward, you know, odd looking gaps. So on that note, what I'm going to do is start adding a little bit more detail in terms of the vehicles. The vehicles are nice and straightforward. Ambulance, please. We get the helicopter access in there as well. Along this section, I'm going to be adding multiple TV vans. I think that makes sense. I think there would be plenty if a big event is on. And then we can add some of the logistics stuff potentially around here as well. Going to keep the branding out of it for the most part over there. I think what we will do is we'll add some DHL stuff. You know, we'll get the proper branding. We've got the decals for it, so we may as well use it and, you know, use some real life brands even over here as well. I didn't quite get the yellow colour correct on this, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab one of the DHL vans and I'm just going to recolour it based on that. The next vehicles that we're going to be adding is some of the cameras. Now, one thing I would have loved to have done is to have the really, really large, tall cranes. Unfortunately, I couldn't really find a good asset or a good solution for that, so I'm just going to stick with the smaller ones, and we're going to dot them right the way around the circuit. Over on the left-hand side of the track, I am going to have extensive sort of fan zone stuff over here as well. Going to keep the colours sort of reasonably uniform, and I think what we can do is fill a few gaps with some decals as well, or some net lanes rather. As I said, I'm going to try and keep the decals to a minimum. All these little spaces can be filled with additional food kiosks and food stalls. That makes sense, I think. We're going to add a little bit of security here and there, again, where it makes sense. We want to keep the public out of the restricted areas. And again, a nice gap filler is vehicles in this type of build. Like you would expect, obviously, there's an awful lot of temporary access that's required, and obviously that needs to be backed up and brought into the fore by various different vehicles, trucks, vans, and all that kind of stuff. Much like that other area I was talking about with the logistics stuff, I am going to keep the fan zones relatively light on the detailing. I don't want to add too much, but again, where obvious things make sense and where obvious gaps need to be filled, we'll, you know, take action on that. So a little bit of recoloring work needs to be done on a few of the assets here. I want these cameras looking black. I want the removal vehicles to be yellow, and again, another bit of a fan zone. This is the furthest away one. I guess these are the cheapest tickets further away from the track. But again, same sort of idea. Some of the Japanese office assets, some of the food stalls, and again, not spending too much time on it. I'm going to just provide an extra little bit of parking for cars. We've not got too much on the go here, and I just reduced the overall footprint of it. I thought it was maybe just a little bit too much, so I wanted to bring things back down a wee bit. Using the same trick again, filling the gaps with the vehicles. But I think all of this stuff, once it's in place, it will make a really, really nice background for some of the track. So as a bit of a temporary measure, I'm just putting some trees over here. This whole place will be redeveloped in later episodes. If you've got any good ideas, guys, what you'd like to see, just drop them in the comments. I'm open for ideas. But in terms of grabbing some nice screenshots and some nice cinematics for the end of the video, then chucking in just a little bit of basic tree brush there, I think that makes sense. Now, I almost forgot to put this in. I wanted to have that big jumbotron you see in the hairpin section, and I think this looks really cool. We can actually get a little bit of Aston Martin. I'm not going to feature otherwise in this video, unfortunately, because of the F1 car models that we have, but at least I'm happy to get them in, even if it's just a decal. Now, given the start that they look to have in pre-season, this might be their best position in the entire calendar. We'll see how they get on this year, I guess, eh? With the back of the pit lane just nicely detailed and jam-packed with different vehicles, I'm going to turn our attention to the front of the pit lane. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lay them out so you can have a look at them. I'm not going to necessarily keep them here. I am going to be sending them around the track, but I'll show you how I'm going to do that in just a minute. These cars are from the 2020 season. One thing I would note is that you can see there that there's a little fire icon there and Find It. That's just indicating that you might have performance issues. I guess these things have got a high poly count or triangle count or whatever the correct terminology is, but just a word of caution if you are going to be using them yourself. Now, a little bit of detailing was in order. I'm just going to chuck a few props down here. So we have these gas canisters, and I've also put down some barrels, which will essentially act as tyres as well. So much like what we have around the, the other parts of the circuit. I am going to cone these fan zones off. These are basically closed for now. Remember, we're not on race day. We are very much in preparation mode for the weekend ahead. Now, I did want to add a little bit of decal work on the track itself, I think, just to kind of dirty it up a little bit. Mostly using El Gendo's dirt decals, which are really, really nice. You can get a nice contrast between the dark ones, the dirt ones, and then you add the lighter ones to kind of make it a little bit unique for your own, for your own build. Around some of the corners, I'm just going to add some of Sully's tyre mark decals. Again, nothing too mad, it's just to add a wee bit of contrast. I guess you could go completely mental with this and have it all the way around the track, but I don't really want to get into it. To add an extra bit of interest, I'm going to just put in a little crash here. Now this, in fact, was the top comment from my previous F1 video. Obviously, I had to put it in to this one. Poor lads. Now I did mention earlier on we don't have Aston Martin cars, but we do have Racing Point. And who raced for Racing Point in 2020? That's right, Mr. Stroll. So there we go, don't worry, he is safe, he managed to get out okay. And yeah, I had to do it. So final few details really as the track comes together. I'm going to use the tree brush or prop brush I guess, and use some of Sully's Citizens. Again, do it super light. I want a little bit of activity, but obviously it's not the full, it's not the full event today. I very nearly forgot to add the pit wall. This is where you get team managers and whatnot, and I will just add a carport, I think this is, add some of the lanes. And then what I'm going to do is just lighten that up with a slightly different surface, and that should differentiate it from the actual track itself. I did consider actually illuminating the entire track. I'm not too sure. I don't think they have night races in Zandvoort, not that I'm aware of anyway. But I thought it might look pretty cool. I'm going to use the big LED lights from the from the workshop, but unfortunately there's just far too much flickering. That doesn't look good at all, does it? Unfortunately, so yeah, I had to scrap that idea. What I decided to do then was just take them all out, and rather than illuminating the track, I just illuminated all the support areas around it, and really anywhere where we'd get pedestrians, I'm just going to light it up. And to be honest, it looked okay, not too bad. I think it would look weird without it if you're looking at it at night. Now, I did decide to keep one of the cars in the pit lane. We're going to give them some engineers. Again, we're going to be using some of the motorcycle stuff from Sully, and that's going to give us the impression that we've got some proper engineers here doing nothing. So earlier on in the video, I showed you really just how to make the bus routes specifically on this type of track where you have to have some bank sections and you have to use invisible roads. What I'm going to be doing here is just repeating the process for each of the teams. They're going to have their own route. I've used the transport policy adjuster by Sunny X, and that's going to let us really just have a bit more control over the assigned vehicles. So I can bring the assigned vehicles down to just one, individual bus or car, or two, which is what I'm doing for most of the teams. So what I'd like to do now is to show you guys a little fixed camera view lap of the track. We're going to follow a few of the cars around here, led by Mercedes, and we're going to basically start off at Stroll Corner. So the way I managed to get these working as actual F1 cars going around the track was to grab the bus asset in the editor, delete the mesh, and then just replace it with the mesh for the individual F1 cars. I'll share these in the Discord if anybody wants to use them. Just use your warning applies. These aren't officially supported. They can cause issues, they can cause your game to crash and all that kind of good stuff. And obviously we spoke about the performance issues potentially using them as well. But if you want to grab them, as I said, I'll stick them on Discord and feel free to give them a go yourself. But I have to say, getting to this point in the video and getting to this point in the track, it really does feel good. And I'd love to have this on my original F1 track. And perhaps I might go back there and add them in and see how it gets on. Performance in that city though is horrendous. It is a stuttery mess, so probably not, unfortunately, but I think we can all enjoy a few laps in this one. I am going to give you guys a first person view just in a minute or two as well once we get the cinematics out of the way, but for the time being we can at least enjoy this. This, I reckon, is probably my favourite spot in the entire build. It's really cool, I have to say. I must admit I do enjoy it. I wish I had some cars running in this shot actually, but it would have been a bit better. but I think I'm going to take a minute or two just to kind of pick out a few bits and pieces that I enjoy and a few bits and pieces that perhaps I would have maybe liked to add into the build. So there's a few things really. I think I would have liked to add a podium, but I think the podium in this track is basically a truck. I think it's mobile. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but there really just wasn't a space for it. Starting lights, of course, you know, it's an F1 track, it should have starting lights, but without using custom assets, there was really no other way of adding that. I absolutely want to try and avoid adding custom assets, you know, local assets if I can. Obviously, there's an obvious exception to that rule with the F1 cars, but really there was no other way of doing it, and it was kind of integral to the actual build itself. I mentioned, of course, at the start of the video, I'd like to got some really tall camera cranes, you know, big telescopic cameras, but, you know, there just isn't the asset for it, unfortunately. And braking markers on the corners, well, I just ran out of time. I just didn't have the scope for it in the end. But I think we can all agree we're not really short of things to look at. There is obviously a ton of detailing put into this build, so a couple of little details like that, I don't think are going to be particularly missed. I think the decision to redo the landscaping around it, you know, and not do the sand dunes was the right call. Obviously, it's not beside a beach, it's not beside the sea. It really wouldn't make sense doing sand dunes here anyway. So having a look at the build area zoomed right out, you can see that we've got, you know, some clear opportunities for building out the area later on. Potentially a golf course might look good on there, I'm not too sure. We'll ask Lance, see what he says. So let's take a look at that first person camera lap. Obviously it's not going to look as good as the F1 25 game, but it's the best I can do. Here you can see we've got those sort of bumps and lumps there going around turn 3, but actually the rest of the course, it looks relatively flat. I think you can probably see the lumps and the bumps a little bit more when the cars are running a bit slower. When it's speeded up, you maybe don't notice it quite so much. That said, you do see a few little imperfections around the road, but on the grand scheme of things, it's looking pretty smooth. For me, one of the biggest and striking differences between the tracks is really just the colour on the track itself, and I spoke about that earlier on, of course. We can really only use the white walls, I can't apply decals on there, so I think that's really something I would like to see possible potentially later down the line, but of course I've added the colour at every opportunity on every other asset that I can, and try and make things look a little bit more interesting. But here we are, just going into the final corner, the big banked one at the end. Off into the final straight, over the lumps and bumps on that corner as we know, and off we go. So that was Zandvoort in Noevorden in City Skylines 2. Thank you all so much for watching. Huge big thank you to our members on Patreon and YouTube. Take care of yourselves, guys. I'll see you in the next one.